The morning sunlight streamed through the office windows, casting a sterile glow over the rows of cubicles and sleek desks scattered with laptops, coffee cups, and neatly stacked files. As I moved through the familiar paths of the office, I couldn't shake the feeling of impending change. Something was simmering beneath the surface, and while I couldn't quite place my finger on it, I felt it pressing on my shoulders with each step I took. But maybe that was just the constant weight of trying to keep everything in balance: work, finances, my marriage. I set down my purse on my desk, checking my phone out of habit to see if there was any message from Dan, my husband. Nothing. I wasn't exactly surprised. He'd been quiet lately, not only over the phone but in person too. Ever since he lost his job, his confidence had taken a dive, and the man I'd married, the one who was always smiling, who made me laugh even on my worst days, had become someone I barely recognized. His silence spoke volumes, and I was often left wondering if he felt like a failure, like he couldn't support us anymore. Just as I was about to get lost in my thoughts, the sound of Mr. Graham's office door opening snapped me back to reality. Mr. Graham, my boss, strode out into the open office space, his tall figure commanding attention even from a distance. He was dressed, as always, in a sharply tailored suit, the crisp fabric somehow making him look even more intimidating than usual. His mere presence was a constant reminder of the high standards he expected, and he'd never hesitated to let me know when I didn't meet them. I'd been working for him for nearly 3 years, and while I'd managed to get the hang of his demanding nature, every day still felt like a test I had to pass. Mr. Graham was known for his ruthless attention to detail, his refusal to settle for anything less than perfection. And though he rarely gave compliments, I'd occasionally catch a slight nod or approving glance when I managed to meet his expectations. As he walked toward me, my stomach clenched a bit, even though I hadn't done anything wrong. That was the effect he had on people, the ability to make you question yourself, to feel like you had to be at your best simply because he was watching. "Good morning, Ms. Lawson," he said, his voice low and steady. I managed a polite smile, hoping it didn't betray the nerves I always felt around him. "Good morning, Mr. Graham. How can I help you today?" He studied me for a moment, his dark eyes assessing as they scanned over my desk. "Have you prepared the financial summary for the board meeting tomorrow?" "Yes," I replied, nodding. "I'll have it on your desk by lunchtime. I'm just waiting for a couple of final numbers from accounting." He inclined his head slightly, as if to say he'd already assumed I was on top of things. "Good. I expect it to be flawless." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving me feeling oddly relieved. That was the thing about Mr. Graham. He had this knack for making you feel like every little detail mattered, like your entire career rested on the accuracy of a single spreadsheet. And in a way, it did. I threw myself into my work, the hours blurring together as I compiled the last figures for the report. The steady rhythm of typing, clicking, and the quiet murmur of voices from the nearby cubicles grounded me, providing a semblance of peace amidst the pressure. But I couldn't ignore the underlying tension that had been building over the past few months, the feeling that something was slipping away from me, maybe my sense of self, my happiness, or perhaps even my marriage. Dan and I had always been close. He was the type who could light up any room he walked into, with his easy smile and warm, gentle nature. But lately, since he lost his job, it was as if he'd become a shadow of the man he used to be. And I hated admitting it, but I'd started to feel more and more like I was carrying the weight of our lives alone, like I had to keep everything together because he couldn't. Sometimes, I wondered if he noticed how much I was struggling too, or if he was simply too caught up in his own despair to see it. The sound of footsteps approaching my desk pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up to see Lucy, one of my closest colleagues, smiling as she leaned against the edge of my desk. "Hey, you want to grab some lunch? I could use a break," she said, her voice light and friendly. I glanced at the time on my computer screen and realized it was already noon. "Sure, let me just save this file, and I'll be right with you." As we walked to the little cafe around the corner, Lucy filled me in on the latest office gossip. She was always in the know, her sharp eyes and quick wit making her the go-to person for anyone who wanted to stay updated on the inner workings of the company. But today I found myself struggling to keep up with her chatter, my mind too weighed down by the stresses that had been piling up. "Are you okay?" Lucy asked suddenly, noticing my silence. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." She nodded knowingly. "It's Mr. Graham, isn't it? He's so intense sometimes." I sighed, grateful that she understood. "He's just, well, you know how he is. I feel like I'm constantly walking on eggshells around him." Lucy laughed, though it was more sympathetic than amused. "Join the club. I swear, the man has a way of making everyone feel inadequate, no matter how hard they work." Despite my exhaustion, I chuckled, feeling a bit lighter. He definitely keeps us on our toes. The truth was, though Mr. Graham intimidated me, there was something almost magnetic about him. He had a presence that was hard to ignore, a quiet confidence that drew people in, even as it unsettled them. I hated to admit it, but part of me respected his intensity, admired the way he commanded attention without ever raising his voice. After lunch, I returned to the office feeling somewhat refreshed, ready to dive back into my work. As I sat down at my desk, my phone buzzed with a message from Dan. "Hey, I'm going to be home late tonight. I have a meeting with a friend about a potential job lead." I felt a pang of disappointment, though I quickly pushed it aside. This was good news. If Dan could find work, maybe things would start to feel normal again. Maybe we'd stop tiptoeing around each other, pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. But the familiar ache of loneliness settled over me as I typed out a quick response, trying to keep the disappointment from leaking into my words. "That's great. Good luck, and let me know how it goes." I put my phone down and turned back to my computer, but my focus was broken, my mind drifting to thoughts of what our life had become. I loved Dan, truly, but I couldn't ignore the resentment that had started to creep in, the feeling that I was the only one holding us together. As the afternoon stretched on, Mr. Graham summoned me into his office to review the report. I entered his office, the air thick with his cologne, a rich, woody scent that somehow suited him perfectly. He gestured for me to sit as he scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up, his gaze locking onto mine. "Well done, Ms. Lawson. This is exactly what I needed." Relief washed over me, though I tried not to show it too obviously. "Thank you, Mr. Graham. I'm glad it meets your expectations." For a brief moment, he smiled, a rare expression that softened the sharp lines of his face. "I appreciate your dedication, Ella. It doesn't go unnoticed." The words hung in the air, simple yet unexpectedly meaningful. I felt my cheeks flush slightly, and I quickly looked down, hoping he hadn't noticed. But his gaze lingered, and for a second, I thought I saw something more in his eyes, a warmth, maybe even admiration. I brushed the thought away, focusing instead on the pile of work still waiting on my desk. But as I left his office, I couldn't ignore the subtle thrill that lingered in my chest, a feeling I knew I shouldn't be indulging. Yet, in that fleeting moment, I felt seen, valued, and maybe even desired. As the evening crept closer, the usual office hum began to die down. Desks were cleared, computers powered off, and colleagues began gathering their things, eager to escape the demands of the day. I glanced at the clock, almost 6. I still had at least an hour of work ahead of me. Mr. Graham had dropped a last-minute task on my desk, and though it wasn't urgent, I knew he expected it completed by the morning. Most people would complain about working late without overtime pay, but I couldn't afford to be picky. I needed this job more than ever now that Dan and I were treading water financially. Every day, I felt the pressure mounting. We were already behind on several bills, our credit cards were maxed out, and our savings had dwindled to a few $100s, which would barely cover groceries for the next week. Rent was due in just a few days, and the anxiety of whether or not we'd make it kept me awake most nights. Dan had been on the job hunt for weeks, but the market wasn't in our favor. Every day, I watched him leave the house with a forced smile, a folder of resumes in hand, and every evening, he'd return looking more defeated than the day before. It broke my heart to see him like that, but I couldn't let him know how scared I was too. I had to be strong, the steady one. After all, that was my role now, keeping us afloat, holding everything together. I sighed, pushing those thoughts aside and returning to my task. As I typed away, I couldn't shake the persistent worry that I was only one mistake, one oversight, away from losing this job. Mr. Graham was a fair but demanding boss, and I'd seen what happened to employees who couldn't meet his expectations. They were let go with little warning, their desks cleaned out by the end of the day. The thought of being in their place, of walking away with a cardboard box and a severance package, was terrifying. I wouldn't let that happen. I'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let it all slip away now. The office had gone nearly silent when I finally finished up and sent the report. I stretched my arms, feeling the tightness in my shoulders. Just as I was shutting down my computer, I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Mr. Graham standing by my desk. "Still here?" he asked, his tone surprisingly gentle. I nodded, managing a small smile. "Just finishing up that report you asked for." He raised an eyebrow, nodding with approval. "I appreciate that, Ms. Lawson. I know I can rely on you." There it was again, that rare hint of warmth in his voice, the smallest suggestion that he valued my efforts. It shouldn't have mattered so much, but it did. In a world where I often felt invisible at home, in this bustling office, knowing that someone saw my hard work, even if it was my demanding boss, made me feel a little less alone. As he looked at me, I could feel the weight of his gaze, intense and unwavering. I shifted in my seat, feeling a flush rise to my cheeks. It was foolish, really. I knew better than to read into such things, but with Mr. Graham it was hard not to. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room, the only person who mattered. I'd seen him do it in board meetings with clients, even with the office janitor. He had this quiet charisma that drew people in, that made them want to be in his good graces. "Well, good night, Ella," he said, his voice soft. The way he said my name, Ella, made me pause. He usually addressed me formally, Ms. Lawson, like everyone else. But tonight there was a familiarity to his tone, a gentleness that caught me off guard. "Good night, Mr. Graham," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment as if he wanted to say something else, but then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit office. I gathered my things, feeling an odd mix of emotions as I headed out to my car. Relief, exhaustion, and something else, a strange exhilaration that I couldn't quite shake. As I drove home, I replayed the conversation in my mind, analyzing every word, every look. It was silly, of course. Mr. Graham was my boss, nothing more. But the way he'd spoken to me, the look in his eyes, it felt different. And in that small moment, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a spark of excitement, a thrill. I arrived home to find the apartment dark, save for the glow of the television in the living room. Dan was sprawled on the couch, a half-eaten sandwich on the table beside him, his eyes glued to the screen. He barely looked up as I walked in, muttering a quick, "Hey," before returning his focus to whatever show was on. I dropped my purse on the table and went to sit beside him, reaching for his hand. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to keep the hope out of my voice. He shrugged, not meeting my eyes, same as usual. No calls back yet. I squeezed his hand, forcing a smile. "It'll happen. Something will come through. I know it." Dan nodded, but his expression remained distant. I could see the defeat in his eyes, the weight of his own disappointment, and as much as I wanted to reassure him, I felt a pang of resentment. Here I was, working myself to the bone to keep us afloat, while he sat on the couch, wallowing in his misery. It wasn't fair, but I pushed the thought away, telling myself that he was doing his best, that he needed my support, not my frustration. After a quiet dinner, I headed to bed, leaving Dan still on the couch. Lying in the darkness, I couldn't shake the memories of the day, the pressure, the stress, and the strange interaction with Mr. Graham. I felt guilty for the thrill it had given me, for the way my heart had fluttered under his gaze. But as much as I tried to push the thought away, it lingered, a small flicker of something that felt almost like desire. I turned over, glancing at the empty space beside me in bed. Dan and I hadn't been close in months. He'd been so withdrawn, so distant, that it was as if we were just two people sharing a space rather than a married couple. I missed him, missed the warmth, the laughter, the closeness we used to share. But every time I tried to reach out, He seemed to pull further away, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep trying. As I lay there, a thought crept into my mind, one that made my heart race and my stomach twist with guilt. What if things didn't get better? What if this was it, this distant, strained existence, this life of constant worry and loneliness? I pushed the thought away, telling myself that it was just the exhaustion, that things would get better once Dan found Batter, once the bills were caught up. But deep down, a part of me wondered if I was lying to myself. And as much as I hated to admit it, the small, thrilling interactions with Mr. Graham offered a brief escape from the burdens of my life. He was attentive, appreciative, even if only in a professional way. And though it was dangerous, though it made me feel guilty, I found myself looking forward to those small moments in the office, those fleeting exchanges that made me feel seen. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the image of Mr. Graham's face, his dark eyes watching me with that same intensity, the way he'd said my name. And in the quiet of the night, I felt a longing that scared me, a longing for something more, something that I knew could tear my life apart if I let it. The week moved along in a familiar, relentless blur. Every day seemed a carbon copy of the one before, the usual tasks, the same faces, the same tension bubbling under the surface as the end of the month loomed, bringing with it the deadlines that haunted our department. For Mr. Graham, it was business as usual. He pushed hard and demanded more from everyone, with no tolerance for excuses. Despite the stress, a strange anticipation was building in me, one that was almost embarrassing to acknowledge. I'd started noticing the moments Mr. Graham's gaze lingered a second too long. The way his voice softened slightly when he asked me to complete a task, the casual touches that seemed increasingly deliberate, the warmth in his tone, the slight change in the way he said my name. Those things shouldn't have meant so much to me, yet they did, and each time my heart betrayed me, racing in ways it hadn't in a long time. It was a Thursday evening when Mr. Graham approached my desk as I was shutting down for the day. He cleared his throat, a habit he had before making a request, as though it lent a certain formality to what he was about to say. I looked up, surprised to find him lingering there after hours, his expression calm but unreadable. "Ella," he began, pausing for a moment. "Are you busy tonight?" The question caught me off guard. Busy? Did he really expect that I had a social life outside of the office these days? I hesitated, my mind already churning with the possibilities. I could see the slight tension around his eyes, as though he knew this was crossing a line but was determined to see it through. No, I replied a little too quickly. I was just heading home, but if there's something you need." He nodded, a faint smile flickering across his lips. "There's a project I'm working on for our presentation to the board next month, and I could use your input. I know it's late, but I trust your judgment, and this is a bit of a sensitive task." "Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'd be happy to help." He gestured toward his office, leading the way as I gathered my things and followed him. The office was nearly deserted, save for a few lights still flickering on the far side of the building. The silence felt heavy, amplifying each footstep, each breath. The door clicked shut behind us, and I suddenly felt very aware of the fact that we were alone. Mr. Graham walked to his desk, pulling out a folder filled with pages of financial projections and market research. He sat down and motioned for me to take a seat beside him. As I moved closer, I noticed the faintest hint of his cologne, a deep, earthy scent that seemed to fill the room, making my pulse quicken. He leaned forward, close enough that our shoulders nearly brushed, as he spread the papers out before us. "Take a look at this," he said, his voice low. "I need a fresh perspective on these figures. It's a critical piece for our board meeting, and I want to make sure we're covering all our bases." I nodded, trying to focus as I scanned the numbers and charts in front of me. I could feel his gaze on me, his presence a steady warmth at my side, but I forced myself to concentrate, to stay professional. The last thing I needed was for him to sense the tension thrumming through me, the way every small movement or word felt heightened in the quiet of his office. As we worked through the projections, Mr. Graham's tone shifted, becoming more relaxed, almost conversational. He asked my opinions on different strategies, encouraged me my insights, and listened intently to every word I said. He leaned in close when I pointed to a particular section, his eyes studying the page but his arm brushing against mine in a way that sent an unmistakable thrill down my spine. It was subtle, likely accidental, but the effect it had on me was undeniable. Minutes turned into an hour, and I found myself drawn into the conversation, energized by his interest in my thoughts, his respect for my judgment. He was flattering, even charming, in a way that made me forget, just for a moment, that he was my boss. I found myself laughing softly at his occasional dry humor, the playful smirk that would flash across his face when he caught me by surprise with an unexpected insight. "You know, Ella," he said suddenly, breaking the flow of our conversation, "you're one of the most competent people I've had the pleasure of working with. Your dedication, your attention to detail. It's rare to find someone who puts so much into their work." His words took me off guard, and I felt a blush creeping up my neck. "Thank you, Mr. Graham. That means a lot." He chuckled, leaning back slightly. "Please call me David. We're well past formalities by now, don't you think?" I hesitated, the name feeling strange on my lips. "David." He smiled, a warmth in his gaze that made me feel unexpectedly comfortable. I could sense that he was letting me in, breaking down the barriers that had always defined our professional relationship. And as much as I knew I shouldn't, I found myself responding to that openness, wanting to know him beyond the title and the suit. After a while, he leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms in a way that made him look more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. He watched me for a moment, a contemplative look in his eyes, as though he was deciding how much to say next. "Ella," he began slowly, "I don't often share personal details, but these late nights, these endless demands, it's not easy for me either. There's a lot of pressure at this level, and sometimes I wonder if I'm doing the right thing." I looked at him, genuinely surprised. He'd always struck me as invincible, as someone who thrived on the intensity of his position. But now, seeing this vulnerability, I felt a strange sense of connection, a desire to ease his burden in some way. "Everyone thinks you have it all figured out, David," I said softly. "But I think sometimes we're all just trying to keep it together the best we can." He nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at me. "You get it, don't you? It's rare to find someone who does." For a moment we sat there in silence, a quiet understanding passing between us. I could feel the weight of the unspoken words between us, the subtle electricity in the air. It was dangerous, this closeness, this shared vulnerability, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Ella," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm glad you're here, tonight, with me." The words hung in the air, and my heart raced as I struggled to find a response. There was a warmth in his eyes, a softness that made me feel seen, appreciated, in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. And in that moment, the weight of my life outside this office, the struggles with Dan, the constant financial worry faded away, leaving only the undeniable pull between us. I'm glad too," I whispered, my voice trembling. He leaned in slightly, his hand brushing against mine, the touch lingering just long enough to set my skin alight. I knew I should pull away, maintain the professional boundaries that defined our relationship. But in that instant, I didn't want to. I wanted to lose myself in the warmth of his gaze, in the quiet connection we'd found in the solitude of his office. He cleared his throat, pulling his hand back, but not his gaze. "I think we've made some good progress on the report," he said, his voice back to its usual steady tone, though I could see the hint of something more in his eyes. "Yes," I replied, forcing myself to focus. "I'll make the final adjustments tomorrow and have it ready for the board meeting." He nodded, standing up and gathering the papers, his movements careful, measured. "Thank you, Ella. I couldn't have done this without you." As I gathered my things and prepared to leave, I felt a strange sense of reluctance, a part of me wanting to stay, to let the moment linger just a bit longer, but I knew I couldn't. Whatever this was, it couldn't go any further. "Good night, David," I murmured as I turned to leave, feeling his gaze on my back as I walked out the door. "Good night, Ella," he replied softly, his voice a gentle echo in the quiet office. As I stepped into the cool night air, a flurry of emotions washed over me. I knew I should feel guilty, ashamed even, but instead, I felt alive, invigorated in a way I hadn't in years. And as I drove home, I couldn't shake the thought that tonight had been a turning point, that something in my life had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. I couldn't shake the evening's events, replaying them in my mind with every mile I drove. My fingers gripped the steering wheel as I navigated the familiar roads back to our apartment, the weight of Mr. Graham's wire, or rather, David's words, settling heavily on my chest. "I'm glad you're here. Tonight. With me." The memory of his hand brushing against mine lingered, sending a shiver through me as I tried to focus on the road. It was foolish to let such a small gesture mean so much. I told myself that. I reminded myself of the lines we weren't supposed to cross, of the professional boundaries that should have kept us apart. But the thrill of his attention, of being seen and valued by someone so driven and commanding, had me feeling things I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about the excitement of doing something forbidden, it was about being reminded of my own worth, of feeling desired in a way that was too complicated to dismiss. I glanced at my phone, noticing a text from Dan that had come in earlier in the evening. The message was brief, almost impersonal, informing me he'd gone to bed early and wouldn't wait up. A pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. I knew he didn't suspect anything, why would he? I had always been the reliable one, the loyal one. But lately I felt more like a stranger in my own life, navigating a marriage that felt increasingly distant and a work life that had started to blur dangerously with my personal boundaries. When I pulled into the driveway, the apartment was dark, quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, careful not to make too much noise. Though I knew Dan wouldn't be disturbed, I slipped out of my heels and padded softly down the hallway, pausing at the entrance to our bedroom. He was sprawled across the bed, his back turned to me, his breathing soft and steady. For a moment I just stood there, watching him, a wave of sadness washing over me. This man, my husband, the person I'd vowed to love and cherish forever, why did he feel so far away? Why couldn't I reach him? I couldn't remember the last time we'd sat down and talked about what was going on between us, about the weight he was carrying, and the ways it was affecting us. I longed for that connection, for the warmth we used to share. But every time I reached out, he seemed to pull further away, retreating into himself. I slipped quietly into bed, careful not to disturb him, though I doubted he'd notice if I did. The cool sheets felt strangely comforting, grounding me as I tried to push away the confusing emotions swirling inside me. I lay there in the darkness, my mind drifting back to David, to the way he'd looked at me, the warmth in his voice when he said my name. I shouldn't feel this way. I knew that. I shouldn't be letting my mind wander down paths that led nowhere good. And yet I couldn't deny it. In those moments with David, I felt alive. I felt seen, understood, in a way that was increasingly missing from my life with Dan. A guilty thrill coursed through me, and I found myself questioning how far I would let this go. Could I really walk this path? Could I risk everything for a feeling that might be fleeting, a connection that might not even be real? The next morning I woke before Dan, slipping out of bed with a quiet sigh and heading to the bathroom to get ready. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, studying the tired eyes that stared back at me. There was a heaviness there, a weariness that came from too many sleepless nights, too much worry, and, now, too much guilt. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, two men, and two versions of myself, the faithful wife, and the woman who craved something more, something forbidden. As I got ready for work, I couldn't help but wonder what today would bring. If David would expect me to stay late again. If he would make another excuse to be close, to bridge the space between us that was quickly vanishing. A part of me feared it, but another part, a part one hated admitting wanted it, longed for that spark, that reminder that there was still passion, excitement, and desire somewhere within me. The office was bustling by the time I arrived, everyone moving with the frenetic energy that came with the end of the fiscal quarter. I threw myself into my work, trying to drown out the guilt and confusion that weighed on me. But even as I worked, my mind drifted back to last night, to the way David's hand had lingered just a second too long, to the way he'd said my name. I could still feel his presence, his touch, like a ghost haunting me. Around lunchtime, Lucy came by my desk, her cheerful demeanor a welcome distraction from the storm of emotions inside me. "Lunch?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with the same warmth she always carried. I appreciated Lucy's energy, her knack for making the world feel a little lighter, a little brighter. "Yeah, that sounds good," I replied, grabbing my purse. As we walked to the cafe around the corner, Lucy launched into a story about her weekend plans, her excitement contagious. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in her stories, my mind kept drifting, replaying last night over and over. Lucy seemed to notice my distraction, her laughter fading as she looked at me with concern. "Ella, are you okay? You seem a little off," she said gently, her brows furrowing. I forced a smile, trying to appear unbothered. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind, I guess." She nodded, giving me a sympathetic look. "Is it work? Or home?" For a moment, I considered confiding in her, telling her about the strange shift in my relationship with David, about the tension and confusion that had taken root in my life. But I couldn't bring myself to say the words, to admit that I was dangerously close to crossing a line I never thought I'd approach. "It's a bit of both," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Just the usual stress, you know." She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here, you know that, right?" I nodded, feeling a pang of gratitude for her friendship. "Thanks, Lucy. I appreciate it." We chatted about lighter topics for the rest of lunch, and I felt myself relax, the weight of my guilt easing slightly under her warmth and kindness. But as soon as we returned to the office, I found myself glancing at David's closed office door, wondering if he was inside, if he was thinking about last night, too. The day passed in a blur, my work barely registering as I fought to keep my mind focused. But as the hours ticked by, I felt the tension building, a strange anticipation settling over me. I told myself it was foolish, that nothing had happened, that nothing would happen. But that didn't stop my heart from racing every time I thought about him, about the way he'd looked at me, the way he'd made me feel. When 5 o'clock rolled around, I gathered my things, preparing to head home, hoping to escape the turmoil that had consumed me all day. But as I walked past his office, the door opened, and there he stood, his gaze meeting mine, with a softness that made my breath catch. "Ella," he murmured, his voice gentle, familiar. I felt the pull, the strange magnetism that drawn me to him last night, and I knew that I was in deeper than I'd ever intended. I forced a smile, my voice steady even as my heart pounded in my chest. "Good night, Mr. Graham." A faint smile touched his lips, a hint of something unspoken in his gaze. "Good night, Ella." I walked out of the office, my heart racing, my mind swirling with the weight of what I was feeling. And as I drove home, I realized that I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could shatter my world if I let it. But even as I tried to push the thoughts away, the memory of his touch, his voice, lingered, haunting me, tempting me, leaving me with a longing I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the inevitable interaction with David. The air between us had grown thick with unspoken tension, and I didn't trust myself around him, not with the way my thoughts had been spiraling since that first late night. But when I walked in, there he was, standing by my desk, a steaming coffee in his hand and a small, unreadable smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Good morning, Ella," he said, his tone carrying a warmth that felt entirely out of place in the bustling office. "Good morning, Mr. Graham," I replied, forcing myself to stay composed as I slid into my chair, trying to ignore the faint flush that crept up my cheeks. He held out the coffee, his fingers brushing mine as I took it from him. "I know you're not a morning person," he said with a soft chuckle. "Thought you might appreciate a little help starting the day." The gesture, simple as it was, caught me off guard. I managed a small smile, clutching the cup as if it were an anchor. "Thank you," I appreciate it. He leaned against the edge of my desk, crossing his arms as he looked down at me. Are you free after hours tonight? He asked, his voice casual, though his gaze held a familiar intensity. I could use some help going over the final strategy for the board meeting next week. There it was again, another invitation. Another subtle push to stay late, to blur the boundaries between us just a little more. I knew I should say no, that I should set clear limits for the sake of my own sanity. But I found myself nodding, compelled by the pull that seemed to override every sensible thought. Yes, I can stay, I replied softly, unable to meet his eyes. Good, he murmured, his smile widening. I'll see you in my office at 7. Then. All day I felt the anticipation building, each passing hour adding weight to the impending evening. I tried to keep busy, focusing on my tasks, but my mind drifted constantly, replaying the moments we'd shared, the warmth in his voice, the way he looked at me with a softness that felt deeply personal. The excitement I felt was tinged with guilt, a reminder that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't fully understand, something that could unravel everything I'd worked so hard to hold together. When the clock struck 7, I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and made my way to his office. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open, catching sight of him seated at his desk, his jacket draped over his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked up as I entered, his expression brightening in a way that made my pulse quicken. Come in, Ella, he said, gesturing to the chair beside him. I've been looking forward to this. I settled into the seat, forcing myself to focus on the documents he spread across the desk. We discussed the strategy in detail, his voice low and steady as he guided me through the numbers, the projections, the intricate web of decisions that would shape the company's future. But as the minutes passed, the conversation began to shift, his tone softening, his gaze lingering on me a little longer each time he spoke. You know, Ella, he murmured after a while, leaning back in his chair, I don't often get the chance to work with someone as capable as you. It's rare to find someone who not only understands the numbers but can see the bigger picture. I looked down, flattered and unnerved by his praise. Thank you, Mr. Graham. That means a lot. David, he corrected gently, his smile warm. I think we're well past formalities by now, don't you? I nodded, trying to suppress the thrill his words sent through me. David. For a moment we sat in silence, his eyes fixed on me, as if searching for something unspoken, something he hadn't yet dared to say. I felt a strange vulnerability in that gaze, a sense of raw honesty that I hadn't expected. Ella, he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, I want you to know that I value you, not just as my assistant, but as someone I can rely on, someone I trust. I don't think I've ever had that with anyone else. His words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I felt my heart racing, my mind spinning as I tried to process what he was saying, what he was asking of me. There was a gravity to his tone, a seriousness that made me feel like this was more than just a late-night work session. Thank you, David, I replied, my voice trembling. That means a lot to me too. He leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine, his expression softening in a way that felt intimate, almost vulnerable. Ella, he murmured, I don't want you to feel obligated, but if there's any chance that you might feel the same, that there might be something more between us. I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding as the meaning of his words settled over me. He was offering something I hadn't expected, something that both thrilled and terrified me. I knew I should say no, that I should end this before it spiraled out of control. But the longing in his eyes, the warmth in his voice, it was too much to resist. I don't know what to say, I whispered, feeling the weight of my own confusion, my own conflicting desires. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, the touch sending a spark through me that left me breathless. You don't have to say anything, Ella, he murmured, his voice a gentle reassurance. I just wanted you to know how I feel, and that if you ever wanted to explore that, I'd be here. The offer was simple, unspoken, but it carried a depth that I couldn't ignore. I felt my resolve weakening, the walls I'd built around myself crumbling under the weight of his attention. his desire. I knew this was wrong, that it could only lead to heartache, to betrayal. But in that moment, with his hand on mine, with his gaze holding me captive, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. "David," I began softly, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can." He nodded, understanding, his expression gentle. "It's okay, Ella. I don't want to push you into anything you're not ready for. I wanted to be honest with you, to let you know how much you mean to me." His words struck a chord deep within me, stirring something I'd buried long ago, a desire to be seen, to be valued, to be wanted. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a testament to the emotional weight of his words, to the realization that I'd been craving this kind of attention, this kind of connection, for longer than I cared to admit. He brushed the tear away, his touch gentle, tender. "Ella, if this is too much, just tell me. I don't want to make you uncomfortable." I shook my head, feeling a strange sense of relief, of release. "No, it's not that. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that. How much I needed someone to see me." He gave me a sad, understanding smile, his gaze filled with empathy, with a kindness that only deepened my confusion, my longing. "You deserve to be seen, Ella. You deserve to be valued, not just as an employee, but as a person." The words struck me harder than I'd anticipated, bringing with them a flood of emotions that left me feeling raw, exposed. I felt the boundaries slipping further away, the lines between us blurring until I could no longer tell where I ended and he began. And in that moment, I knew that I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change my life in ways I couldn't yet understand. "David," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I don't know what to do." He leaned closer, his hand still on mine, his gaze soft and understanding. "Then let's take this one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just whatever feels right for you." His offer was simple, gentle, and it gave me a sense of control. A feeling that I could choose the path I wanted to take. And though I knew the risks, the potential consequences, I couldn't ignore the warmth in his gaze, the feeling that for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I wanted to be. I think I'd like that," I replied softly, my heart racing as I looked into his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision I'd just made. He smiled, a warmth spreading across his face that made me feel safe, cherished. And in that moment, I knew that, whatever happened, I'd chosen this path willingly, fully aware of the risks, the possibilities. I'd stepped into a new world, one where the rules were my own, where the choices were mine to make. As the days passed, I found myself slipping deeper into this uncertain territory, one foot in the life I'd built with Dan, and the other in a world I'd never anticipated, one colored by stolen glances and quiet moments shared with David. Every day at the office felt charged with an electricity I couldn't ignore, a magnetic pull that grew stronger each time we were in the same room. And yet, the thrill was tempered by a constant, gnawing guilt that haunted me in the quiet moments late at night, when Dan lay beside me, or in the early morning light, when I'd catch my reflection in the mirror and see a woman I barely recognized. I'd always prided myself on being loyal, on upholding the values that mattered to me. And yet, here I was, letting myself be drawn into something I knew was wrong. It was as though I were living in two worlds, split between who I'd always thought I was and the person I seemed to be becoming. The shame was there, lurking just beneath the surface, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I'd have to face it, to make a choice that would either restore my integrity or let it shatter completely. One evening, after a long day of work, I came home to find Dan sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as I entered, a weary expression on his face. "Hey," he said, his voice tired. "I was just going through our bills." I felt a pang of guilt, realizing that while I'd been distracted by my own turmoil, Dan had been carrying his own burden, trying to keep us afloat. I hadn't been there for him, not in the way I should have been, and the realization hit me with a force I hadn't expected. "Anything I can do to help?" I asked, forcing a smile as I set my bag down and moved to stand beside him. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. It feels like no matter how hard we try, we're barely keeping our heads above water. I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, hoping he couldn't sense the turmoil within me. We'll figure it out, Dan. We always do. He nodded, though his gaze remained distant, his expression one of quiet resignation. I wanted to tell him everything. To share the guilt that had been building inside me. To confess the confusion that had taken root in my heart. But the words wouldn't come. How could I burden him with that? How could I add to his pain when he was already struggling to keep himself afloat? As I prepared dinner that night, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me, a suffocating reminder of the boundaries I was beginning to cross. I knew I needed to step back, to put distance between myself and David, to reclaim the part of me that was slipping away. But each time I thought about it, I felt an ache, a sense of loss that I couldn't ignore. When Dan went to bed, I stayed behind in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkened street, the quiet hum of the city a backdrop to my thoughts. I knew I was playing a dangerous game, one that could cost me everything. But the temptation was there, whispering in the back of my mind, a reminder of the thrill, the excitement that had become an escape from the weight of my life. The next morning, as I made my way to the office, I resolved to put an end to it, to pull back from the edge and regain control of my life. I would distance myself from David, maintain a strictly professional relationship, and focus on the life I'd built with Dan. It was the right thing to do, the only choice that would allow me to look myself in the mirror without shame. But when I walked into the office and saw David standing by my desk, his warm smile and gentle gaze waiting for me, my resolve wavered. He had a way of making me feel special, of making me feel like I mattered in a way I hadn't felt in years. And as much as I tried to resist, I couldn't help but be drawn to that feeling, that sense of being seen, valued, desired. "Morning, Ella," he greeted me, his voice soft. "Morning, David," I replied, forcing a casual tone as I took my seat, determined to maintain my boundaries. We worked together in relative silence, exchanging only the necessary words, keeping our interactions strictly professional. But I could feel his gaze on me, could sense the unspoken tension that hung between us, a reminder of the connection we'd shared, the words he'd left lingering in the air. And despite my best efforts, I found myself drawn to him, the pull too strong to ignore. Around noon, he asked me to meet him in his office to review the presentation one last time before the board meeting. I followed him in, closing the door behind me, the quiet click of the latch sealing us in a space where the rest of the world faded away. He spread the documents across his desk, explaining each point with his usual precision, his voice steady and measured. But as he spoke, I couldn't help but notice the way he looked at me, the warmth in his eyes, the gentleness that seemed reserved just for me. It was as though he saw through my defenses, saw the turmoil within me, and understood in a way that both comforted and unsettled me. "Ella," he said softly, his voice breaking through my thoughts, "are you okay?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I felt my resolve crumbling, the weight of my emotions pressing down on me. I'm fine," I replied, my voice shaky. "Just a little overwhelmed, I guess." He nodded, his gaze steady, his expression one of quiet understanding. "If there's ever anything you need, anything I can do to help, you know I'm here, right?" The words felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I didn't have to face this alone. But at the same time, they were a temptation, an invitation to let go of the boundaries I'd clung to surrender to the feelings I'd been fighting. "Thank you, David," I murmured, feeling the sting of tears as I looked down, unable to meet his gaze. That means a lot." He reached across the desk, his hand covering mine in a gesture that was both comforting and charged with unspoken emotion. His touch was warm, steady, a quiet assurance that I couldn't ignore. And in that moment, I felt my resolve slipping, my defenses crumbling, as I looked up, meeting his gaze with a vulnerability that I hadn't allowed myself to feel. "Ella," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know this is complicated. I know there's a lot at stake. But I can't pretend I don't feel this way. I can't pretend that you don't mean something to me." His words hung in the air, a confession that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I wanted to pull away, to put distance between us, but I couldn't. I was drawn to him, to the warmth in his gaze, the gentleness in his touch, the sense that he saw me in a way no one else did. "David," I whispered, my voice trembling. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can handle this." He nodded, his expression softening as he squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance that eased the ache in my chest. "Whatever you need, Ella. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But I just needed you to know." The honesty in his voice, the sincerity in his gaze, it was too much to bear. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a testament to the confusion, the guilt, the longing that had taken root in my heart. And as he brushed the tear away, his touch tender, I knew that I was standing at a crossroads, a moment that would define everything. I need time," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I need to figure this out." He nodded, his gaze filled with understanding, with empathy. "Take all the time you need, Ella. I'll be here, whatever you decide." As I left his office, I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me, a reminder of the choice that lay ahead. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, two men, and two versions of myself. I had to make a decision, to choose a path that would either save my marriage or unravel everything I'd worked so hard to build. But as I walked away, the memory of his touch, his voice, lingered, a quiet echo that left me questioning everything I thought I knew, everything I believed I wanted. And in the quiet of my own thoughts, I knew that the choice I faced would change everything, in ways I couldn't yet understand. The following evening, I found myself still at the office, even after most of my colleagues had left for the day. I wasn't entirely sure why I'd stayed. Maybe I was avoiding going home, facing the emptiness that had crept into my marriage. Or maybe I was hoping for anything that would fill the void that had taken root in my heart. I kept my head down, attempting to focus on the report in front of me, but the numbers blurred on the screen, my concentration slipping with each passing minute. A soft knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts, and I looked up to see David standing there, his expression unreadable. "Still here?" he asked, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Just trying to finish up a few things," I replied, forcing a casual smile. He closed the door behind him, and suddenly the room felt smaller, the air heavier. He moved to stand beside me, his gaze lingering on me in a way that felt both familiar and unsettling. "You work too hard, you know that?" he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. I laughed, a faint, hollow sound. "Takes one to know one." For a moment we stood in silence, the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on us. I could feel my heart pounding, each beat a reminder of the tension that had been building between us, the boundaries that had begun to blur. And as much as I knew I should pull back, put distance between us, I couldn't bring myself to move. "Ella," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can't stop thinking about you." The words were like a match striking against flint, igniting something inside me that I'd tried so hard to keep buried. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that instant, I saw everything I'd been avoiding: the longing, the desire, the undeniable connection that we'd both been dancing around for weeks. "David," I began, my voice trembling, my mind racing with 1,000 reasons why this was wrong, why I couldn't do this. But every reason faded away under the intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his presence. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush a stray strand of hair from my face. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he were giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I wanted this more than I'd ever allowed myself to admit. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, his hand lingering on my cheek. "If this isn't what you want, just tell me, and I'll walk away." I felt my breath catch, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I knew I should tell him to stop, to walk away, to leave me alone. But the truth was, I didn't want him to leave. I wanted this, wanted him, in a way that terrified me, yet thrilled me all the same. Instead of answering, I reached out, my fingers finding his hand, guiding it to my cheek. The warmth of his skin against mine sent a shiver through me, a reminder of the fire that had been smoldering between us, waiting for a spark. His gaze softened, his hand moving to cradle my face, his thumb brushing gently along my cheek. "Ella," he whispered, his voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache, and in that moment, I felt the last of my defenses crumble, the walls I'd built around myself shattering under the weight of my own longing. I closed the distance between us, my hands finding their way to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my fingertips. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, and I felt a sense of safety, of warmth, that I hadn't felt in years. It was as if in his embrace all the doubts, the fears, the guilt faded away, leaving only the pure, unfiltered desire that had been simmering between us. He tilted my chin up, his eyes searching mine, as if giving me one last chance to pull back, to stop this before it went any further. But I didn't want to stop. I wanted to lose myself in this moment, to surrender to the feelings I'd kept hidden for so long. And then his lips were on mine, soft, gentle, testing the boundaries we'd both been so careful to keep. The kiss was hesitant at first, a tentative exploration, but as I leaned into him, as I let myself fall into the warmth of his embrace, it deepened, the intensity building with each passing second. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt the world around us fade away, leaving only the two of us, tangled together in a moment that felt both dangerous and inevitable. The feel of his hands on my skin, the warmth of his breath against my neck, it was intoxicating, a heady mix of desire and longing that left me breathless, my heart racing as I surrendered to the passion that had been simmering between us. We moved together, the rhythm of our bodies aligning in a way that felt both familiar and thrillingly new. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word sent a shiver through me, a reminder of the fire that had been ignited, a fire that threatened to consume everything in its path. In that moment, there was no guilt, no hesitation, no fear, only the pure, unfiltered connection between us, a connection that felt as natural as breathing. I'd spent so long denying this part of myself, so long convincing myself that I didn't need this, didn't deserve this. But in his arms, I felt whole, complete, in a way that I hadn't felt in years. As we lay together in the quiet aftermath, the silence heavy with the weight of what we'd done, I felt a strange mix of emotions, joy, relief, and a creeping sense of dread. I knew that this moment, this decision, would change everything. I knew that I couldn't go back to the life I'd led before, that the boundaries I'd crossed couldn't be undone. David held me close, his fingers tracing gentle patterns along my back, his touch soothing, comforting. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice filled with concern. I nodded, my gaze drifting to the ceiling as I tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This feels right and wrong, all at the same time." He tightened his hold on me, his lips pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead. "I know," he murmured, his voice filled with understanding, "but I don't regret it, not a single moment." I looked up at him, my heart aching at the sincerity in his gaze, the quiet conviction in his words. I wanted to believe him, to let myself feel the same certainty, but the guilt was already beginning to creep in, a reminder of the life I'd left behind, the promises I'd broken. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice trembling, my heart heavy with the weight of the question. He hesitated, his gaze softening as he considered his response. "That's up to you, Ella," he replied, his voice steady, reassuring. "Whatever you want, whatever you need, I'll be here." His words were a balm to my soul, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this, that I didn't have to face this decision on my own. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in the warmth of his embrace, to let myself be swept away by the intensity of our connection, I knew that reality would come crashing back eventually. The guilt, the fear, the consequences, they were all waiting, just beyond the edges of this moment, a reminder that I couldn't escape the choices I'd made, the boundaries I'd crossed. And as I lay there, tangled in his arms, I felt the weight of those choices pressing down on me, a reminder that I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't control, something that would change my life in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. But for now, in this quiet, stolen moment, I let myself be held, let myself believe, if only for a little while, that this was where I was meant to be. The days following that night with David were a mix of thrilling highs and crushing lows. Each morning I awoke with a fleeting sense of disbelief, replaying the moments we'd shared, the warmth of his touch, the way he'd looked at me as if I were the only person in his world. But by the time I reached the office, reality would sink in, a heavy weight of guilt and confusion settling over me. I could feel the change in our interactions, the way we moved around each other with an unspoken awareness. We tried to keep things professional, maintaining the facade of boss and assistant, but the stolen glances, the fleeting touches, all of it hinted at a secret that we both held close. There was a thrill in it, in the clandestine nature of our connection, but there was also a gnawing dread that lingered in the back of my mind. It didn't take long for the whispers to start. At first, they were subtle, murmurs that I could brush off as workplace gossip. Lucy, ever observant, pulled me aside one afternoon, her gaze wary. "Ella," she said quietly, her voice tinged with concern, "is everything okay? You seem different lately." I forced a laugh, hoping to deflect her suspicion. "Different how?" She studied me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know, just more on edge. And I've noticed you've been spending a lot of time with Mr. Graham. People are starting to talk." My heart raced, but I kept my expression neutral, shrugging off her words as best as I could. "I'm just working hard, that's all. You know how he is always pushing for more." She nodded, though I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced. "Just be careful, okay? Office gossip has a way of spiraling, and I don't want to see you get hurt." I thanked her, brushing off her concern, but her words stayed with me, a constant reminder that our secret was a fragile thing, vulnerable to exposure. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep my professional and personal lives separate. But the reality was far more complicated. Each time David and I were alone, the tension grew, a mix of desire and anxiety that made it hard to think clearly. He would brush his hand against mine as he handed me a document, or his gaze would linger just a little too long during meetings. It was as if we were both teetering on the edge, playing a game we knew couldn't last. One evening, as I was preparing to leave, he asked me to stay for a moment. I hesitated, glancing around the empty office, but I couldn't resist the pull of his gaze, the silent promise in his eyes. I closed the door, my heart racing as I turned to face him. "Ella," he murmured, his voice low, filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "This, what we have, I know it's complicated, but I can't imagine going back to the way things were before." His words sent a shiver through me, a reminder of the connection we'd forged, the intimacy we'd shared. But even as I felt the thrill of his words, the guilt weighed heavy in my chest, a constant reminder of the lines we'd crossed, the promises I'd broken. "David," I replied softly, my voice filled with uncertainty, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. The secrecy, the lies, it's eating away at me." He reached out, his hand finding mine, his touch a balm to the turmoil inside me. "I understand, Ella. I don't want to cause you pain, but I also don't want to lose you." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a testament to the conflict that had taken root in my heart. I wanted him, wanted the connection we'd found, but I couldn't ignore the reality of my life, the marriage I was jeopardizing, the future I was putting at risk. Maybe we need to take a step back," I whispered, the words tearing at me even as I spoke them, "to figure out what we really want, what we're willing to sacrifice." He nodded, his expression pained, but he didn't let go of my hand. "If that's what you need, I'll respect it. But I want you to know, I'm here, no matter what." I pulled my hand from his grasp, the loss of his touch like a cold void settling over me. "Thank you, David," I murmured, forcing a smile. I just need time." He nodded, a sadness in his gaze that mirrored my own, and as I walked out of his office, I felt a sense of finality, a weight pressing down on me as I grappled with the reality of my choices. But the repercussions were only just beginning. The rumors around the office intensified, whispers that seemed to follow me wherever I went, colleagues casting knowing glances in my direction. I could feel their judgment, their suspicion, and though I tried to ignore it, the shame was impossible to escape. Lucy's concern grew, her questions becoming more pointed, more insistent. "Ella, if something's going on, you can tell me," she said one afternoon, her gaze filled with worry. I brushed her off, assuring her that everything was fine, but I knew she didn't believe me, and the weight of the secret, the isolation that came with it, became harder to bear. At home, things with Dan grew more strained. He sensed my distance, my distraction, and though he didn't confront me directly, the tension between us was palpable. We moved through our days like strangers, a silent rift widening between us, fueled by the secrets I couldn't bring myself to share. One night, after a particularly tense dinner, Dan turned to me, his expression weary, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "Ella," he said softly, "are you happy?" The question caught me off guard, a simple inquiry that carried a weight I wasn't prepared to face. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze, my heart aching with the realization that I didn't have an answer. I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own. I feel like I'm losing you, like you're slipping away, and I don't know how to reach you." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a testament to the guilt, the shame that had been building inside me. I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself of the secrets that had taken root in my heart, but I couldn't. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting him, of shattering the life we'd built together. "I'm sorry," I murmured, my voice trembling. I don't know how to fix this." He reached out, his hand covering mine, his touch filled with a warmth that only deepened my sense of regret. "Ella, whatever it is, we can work through it. But I need you to be honest with me. I need to know what's really going on." I looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there, the quiet plea for the truth. And in that moment, I felt the weight of my own betrayal, the realization that I'd been lying not only to him but to myself, pretending that I could live two lives, that I could keep my heart divided. The guilt was overwhelming, a crushing weight that left me feeling exposed, vulnerable. And as I sat there, tangled in my own shame, I knew that I was standing on the edge of a decision, a choice that would define everything. But as much as I wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden myself of the lies, I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in a web of my own making, a prisoner to the choices I'd made, the boundaries I'd crossed. I need some time," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his expression filled with quiet understanding, though I could see the hurt in his eyes, the pain of my distance. "Take all the time you need, Ella," he murmured, his voice gentle. "I'll be here, no matter what." As I pulled away, retreating into the silence of our shared home, I felt the weight of my choices pressing down on me, a reminder of the life I'd left behind, the future I was putting at risk. And in the quiet of my own thoughts, I knew that I was standing at a crossroads, a moment that would define everything, in ways I couldn't yet understand. The days turned into weeks, each one blending into the next, marked by the same hollow feeling that had taken root in my heart. I moved through my life like a ghost, haunted by the decisions I'd made and the ones I hadn't. The office had become a minefield, with the gossip still swirling, whispers that followed me down every hallway. And while I tried to keep my head down, to focus on my work, the weight of what I was carrying was impossible to ignore. David had respected my need for distance, keeping our interactions strictly professional, though there were moments, quiet glances, brief smiles that reminded me of what we'd shared, of what could have been. But those fleeting moments only made the ache in my heart more pronounced, a reminder of the boundaries I'd crossed and the promises I'd broken. At home, things with Dan had reached a quiet, painful impasse. He was kind, patient, but there was a sadness in his eyes that mirrored my own, a silent resignation that neither of us knew how to bridge. We moved through our days in silence, our connection a ghost of what it had once been. And though I wanted to reach out to fix what had been broken, I couldn't bring myself to face the truth, to confess the choices that had led us here. One evening, as I was tidying up after dinner, Dan approached me, his expression calm but serious. "Ella, can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady. I looked up, my heart pounding as I took in the quiet determination in his gaze. "Of course," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He gestured to the living room, and we sat across from each other, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. For a moment, he said nothing, his gaze searching mine, as though looking for an answer he wasn't sure he'd find. "Ella," he began softly, "I don't know what's going on, but I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I need to know where we stand. I need to know if there's still something left between us." The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, the guilt, the shame pressing down on me like a crushing weight. I wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden myself of the lies that had been eating away at me, but the words wouldn't come. "Dan, I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know how we got here or how to fix this." He nodded, his expression filled with quiet understanding, though I could see the pain in his eyes, the hurt that my words had caused. I need to know if you're willing to try. If you're willing to fight for us, for what we had." His words struck a chord deep within me, a reminder of the life we'd built together, the love that had once been so strong. I felt a surge of guilt, a realization that I'd been holding on to something that no longer served either of us, clinging to a life that I'd already left behind. "I want to try, Dan," I murmured, the words a quiet confession. "But I don't know if I can. I don't know if I have it in me." He looked away, his jaw clenched, and I could see the devastation in his expression, the quiet acceptance of the truth he'd feared. "I see," he replied softly, his voice thick with emotion. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark reminder of the life we'd shared, the dreams we'd built together, now crumbling around us. And as I sat there, facing the man I'd once loved with everything in me, I felt the weight of my own choices, the realization that I was the one who had torn us apart. After a moment, he stood, his movements slow, deliberate, as though he were carrying a burden too heavy to bear. He looked at me, his gaze filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "I'll give you space, Ella," he murmured, his voice steady but filled with pain. "Maybe that's what we both need." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with the weight of everything left unsaid. And as he turned to leave, I felt a sense of finality settle over me, a realization that I was standing at the end of a chapter one never thought would end. The next morning, Dan packed a small bag, giving me a gentle smile as he kissed my forehead, a silent goodbye that felt like a wound I'd never be able to heal. I watched him go, my heart heavy, a mix of relief and regret swirling inside me as I faced the reality of what I'd done, of the life I'd chosen to leave behind. The days that followed were filled with a quiet numbness, a sense of loss that left me feeling empty, adrift. I threw myself into my work, hoping to find solace in the routine, but even that felt hollow, a reminder of the choices I'd made, the lines I'd crossed. One evening, as I was preparing to leave, David approached me, his expression calm, though I could see the concern in his eyes. "Ella," he murmured, his voice soft, "how are you holding up?" I forced a smile, though I knew it didn't reach my eyes. "I'm fine," I replied, my voice wavering. He reached out, his hand finding mine, his touch a gentle reminder of the connection we'd shared, the moments that had changed everything. "If you need anything at all, I'm here." I looked down, my heart aching with the weight of his words, the realization that, despite everything, I still felt that pull, that undeniable connection. But even as I felt the warmth of his hand, the comfort of his presence, I knew that this was no longer enough, that I couldn't keep living in the shadows, hiding from the truth. "David," I began softly, my voice trembling, I don't think I can keep doing this." He looked at me, his gaze filled with understanding, though I could see the sadness there, the quiet acceptance of a truth we'd both known was inevitable. I understand, he replied, his voice steady. I want you to be happy, Ella. Whatever that means for you. His words were a balm to my heart, a reminder of the kindness, the respect that had drawn me to him in the first place. And as I looked into his eyes, I felt a sense of closure, a quiet acceptance of the choices I'd made, the paths I'd taken. I need to find myself again, I murmured, my voice barely audible. I need to figure out who I am without everything else. He nodded, his expression filled with understanding, though I could see the pain in his eyes, the quiet loss of what could have been. Take all the time you need, Ella, he said softly, his voice a gentle reassurance. I'll always be here if you need me. As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, a sense of loss, of freedom, of relief. I knew that I was standing at the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, but also with possibility. I'd made mistakes, crossed lines I could never uncross, but I was determined to find my way, to rebuild the pieces of my life, one step at a time. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, a quiet acceptance of the choices I'd made, the life I'd left behind. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it, to embrace the unknown, to find myself again. Because sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. And in the quiet of that moment, I knew that whatever came next, I would be okay. I would find my way, piece by piece, step by step. And in the end, I would be whole again.